Thank you, folks. Archbishop Hebda, thank you. I love you. I love your people. I love this diocese, and it's an honor to call you friend. And I renew to you my gratitude for your gracious hospitality. Bishop Gruss and Jim Ennis, thank you. Thanks for arranging this, for all the preparation and everything. Please go ahead and eat. Lord knows I would, all right? So don't let me hold you up. I'm just grateful to be able to speak now instead of after dinner, because that's always bad. Do you have to speak after dinner, Monsignor Shea? That's tough. No wonder the apostles fell asleep in the agony in the garden, you know, after the Last Supper. Thank you very much, everybody. You don't know how happy I am to be here. You don't know how happy I am anytime I leave New York. So this is to come back to the Midwest. I'm sorry I can't say, because we do it right in New York, because tomorrow is the Feast of the Ascension for us. We didn't capitulate and move it to Sunday. So I have to get back for our big Mass tomorrow at 10. So I got a late flight out tonight, so pardon my departure. I have to do you call it here the Irish exit? You know, when you kind of show up and then you're quick to leave? I do a lot of Irish exits. Do you know what the Irish entrance is? You don't even show up. I do some of those too. All right, let me get to it. You all asked me to, probably because I'm about the only one in the world that knows anything about it, to speak about the founder of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, our beloved Edwin Vincent O'Hara, and some of the vision and philosophy that led to his foundation of this epic apostolate and this magnificent organization, the centennial of which we gratefully celebrate. So, and what I'm going to do, folks, is give you a little bit about the background and his vision, the formation of the conference, and then I'm going to see how that, does it still apply today, some of the concerns that he had, and speak about the future. Does that sound okay? Because I might be an expert on how it was founded. I'm not an expert on rural life now. I grew up in Missouri, but I did not grow up on a farm. Harry Truman, you know, our great president from Missouri, claimed to have worked on a farm. And the historians wonder if he ever did, but he said that when he was addressing the farm wives of America. And he claimed to have grown up on a farm, and he kept saying that his job was to spread manure. And his wife, Bess, was sitting next to kind of a stuffy, one of the chairs of the rural wives, and she said, "Mrs. Truman, you should tell the president that he should say fertilizer, not manure." And Bess said, "Honey, you don't know how long it took me to get him to say manure." All right. Anybody here from Bismarck? I thought so. I knew Monsignor Shea. Well, let me start with this. When Vincent Worley, who was the Bishop of Bismarck, remarked at your first meeting, the first meeting of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference in St. Louis, my hometown, in November 1923, when he said, "Listen, there is something sacramental about country life," no one applauded more vigorously than a man named Edwin Vincent O'Hara, the conference's founder, and perhaps, you let me know if you think so when I'm done in 40 minutes or so, no one applauded more vigorously than the founder, perhaps the most influential leader in American Catholic agrarianism. According to this farm boy, he was a farm boy turned priest, there was no greater challenge facing the Church in the United States than the strengthening of rural life. His upbringing, folks, would show the genesis of this colorful rural solicitude. He was the last of 8 children born to Owen and Margaret O'Hara in 1881 on the 320-acre farm outside of Lanesboro, Ohio. Jim, are you here? Where's Jim? So Jim O'Hara is the grandnephew of Edwin Vincent. Jim, do you visit the farm at all? Is it still there? Okay. Way to go. I know it's not in the family anymore. In fact, it was lost during the Depression, but I didn't know if the farm itself was there. That's in the Diocese of Winona. And there, growing up in Lanesboro, he experienced the family solidarity, the emphasis on virtue, the kind of the rewards of thrift and hard work, and the healthy atmosphere that he would speak about constantly until his death as the first bishop of Kansas City, St. Joseph, in 1956, that this vibrant Catholicism made his consideration of a priestly vocation so natural. And there was no surprise when he entered, St. Paul's Seminary as a student for the Diocese of Winona in 1900. There, as anybody that would know that time, the atmosphere there on this campus was dominated by the towering Archbishop of St. Paul, John Ireland, who was nicknamed the Consecrated Blizzard of the Northwest, whose dynamic approach to life and his personal crusade to prove the harmony between Catholicism and American values left its imprint on that young seminarian. I think Archbishop Hebda, the last time I was in this room eating salad was when you were kind enough to ask me to speak on the centennial of Archbishop Ireland's death, which would have been in 2021. Now, from the beginning, Edwin had kind of been attracted to a frontier setting where priests were scarce and country people needed spiritual assistance. And when the Archbishop of Oregon City, which would become Portland, Alexander Christie, met him, and he expressed that to him, Archbishop Christie invited Edwin to the diocese, and off he went. As so often happens, though, and priests, brother priests and deacons, you're going to know, and bishops, you know how this happens. O'Hara's plans for a rural apostolate didn't materialize because he spent the first 14 years of his ministry in the largest city parish in Portland, in the cathedral. But there, by the way, he would gain national and even international attention in his vigorous programs promoting education and housing and employment, especially, by the way, writing and promoting the first state minimum wage law upheld by the United States Supreme Court. Now, here's the vision. Here's kind of the philosophy from which this O'Hara came, folks. Along with other Catholic ruralists at the beginning of last century, on through the 1930s, and I think in some ways today, O'Hara was a staunch adherent of that traditional Jeffersonian ideal that widespread ownership of small farms by individual families was the best foundation for a strong, upright, civil, democratic republic. The Oregon priest was a believer in what the epic American historian Richard Hofstadter has called the agrarian myth, which holds that such virtues as integrity, thrift, individualism, stability, piety, and family loyalty flourished in a culture dominated by farms and small towns, while cities, bred vice and rootlessness, regimentation, crime, disease, and the destruction of the family unit. Although at times, O'Hara and his fellow ruralists would be criticized as naive romantics, the Lanesboro Farnborough was not. He was not some nostalgic reactionary. On the contrary, he was painfully aware of the perplexities and challenges of rural life. And we devote a chunk of his life to an articulation of his rural ideology and to try to find solutions for it. In May 1920, finally, he got his wish and was named pastor of a rural parish, St. Mary's Parish in Eugene, Oregon. And for 9 years, he would make that parish a rural laboratory of rural pastoral experimentation. He'd also be appointed, everybody, as director of the Rural Life Bureau of the National Catholic Welfare Council in 1921. That was the predecessor of what we today call the USCCB. And, of course, it's from there that he would form the National Catholic Rural Life Conference in 1923. The basis of his rural philosophy was that the farmer, quote, the farmer pursues the most fundamental, the most dignified profession in the whole world. He is the primal producer, the type of citizen which has been in every civilization, the substantial foundation of a stable social order. Farming, O'Hara would insist, was a way of life, not a living, a vocation, not just a business, a sacred profession, not just an ordinary job. And, big time, the value of agriculture was not only in its production of food and fiber, but in its generation of happy, healthy kids. On the farm, the large family was considered an asset to business. O'Hara never grew tired of reminding audiences that the farm is the native habitat of the family. In the country, he would say, there was a unity of purpose, a sharing of responsibility, a routine of life that would draw mom and dad and kids together. Urban industrial life, boo. That took the father out of the home, separated the interests of husband and wife and children, and considered offspring, babies, a financial drain. So what do you get? Divorce, limitation of kids, popular in the cities. In general, concluded the pastor, the family was threatened in the city, but fostered on the farm. As he said in a national radio address in 1934, my philosophy of rural life leads me to desire that the farm continue to minister to the needs of the family. The farm is the native habitat of the family, and it'll be chiefly on the family-sized farm that the family will be able to protect itself against the combined pressures of capitalism, the machine age, and sophisticated luxury. The farm is the natural seat of a united, wholesome, prolific, and happy family. Catholic ruralists, by the way, in this country found a lot of solace in the teachings of the popes, especially in those two grand encyclicals, Rerum Novarum of Leo XIII in 1891 and Quadragesimo Anno of Pius XI in 1931. There, the popes would quote, would support teachings defending private property, the proliferation of small family farms, and they would warn against the peril of a dispossessed rural labor force. They would suggest, those two epic encyclicals, that a distribution of land could cure the rootlessness dominant in modern society. Although part of O'Hara's rural outlook was a disenchantment with urban life, it'd be unfair to claim that he dismissed the city, a charge that might be made of other ruralists at the time. In fact, O'Hara was realistic enough to know that the modern era belonged to the city. Nothing we could do about it. And as has been mentioned, he zealously worked to ameliorate urban evils of unemployment, poor housing, and inadequate food. He even admitted that it was good and natural for some members of rural families to migrate to the city. All he asked was a balance so that society could respect the dignity and necessity of the agrarian profession, and that people recognize that city living was not the panacea that it was made out to be. O'Hara would be an apostle of urban reform as well as rural reform. His point was not that the church should stop being aggressive in social justice in the city, but it should, that vigor should extend to the village and the field, since social justice, from a Catholic point of view, vigorously upheld the right of farmers. As might be imagined, O'Hara and his rural Catholic colleagues asserted the cardinal importance of agrarian life, not just for the clear cultural, financial, social, and political reasons mentioned. They emphasized another big-time dimension of country life, its natural attachment to religion. The hearts of people in the field were naturally open to God. Country life would breed the very virtues religion built upon. Rural people would cultivate a respect for the natural order, a sensitivity to divine intervention in creation, Agrarian life would foster marriage and kids, and country people would crave the spiritual and communal support of their church. While the cities grew pagan, the villages fortified the faith of ages. O'Hara would agree with the man I mentioned in the homily, the Benedictine liturgist and ruralist, Father Virgil Michael up at St. John's in Collegeville, who would write, "Catholic life must be close to nature, for the supernatural in the dispensation of God builds on the natural." It was an integral part of his agrarian philosophy that the church was on the cutting edge in the crusade to preserve country values. It was simple for O'Hara to see. The church needed rural people, and the people of the land sure needed their church. The church needed country people because from them comes future generations, and their mode of life furthered virtue. And the rural people sure needed the church for spiritual sustenance, communal solidarity, direction in life, not only in moral matters, but in economic and social as well. The farmer naturally looked to his church for leadership, not only because of his inbred respect for religion, but because the isolated nature of his life made other influences scarce. It was O'Hara's contention, everybody, that the country pastor, the country priest, had to be a leader respected in all areas which touched his people, not just the spiritual. Healthcare, cooperatives, credit unions, introduction of new farming techniques, entertainment and socials in the parish, updating the rural home. Nothing should escape the concern of the pastor. As he reminded his audiences as he toured the country addressing rural groups, pastors of souls in the country can never be indifferent to the economic and social conditions of the families to whom he ministers. Now, I got to make something clear. Although O'Hara clung to a romantic view of the splendor and simplicity of country life, he was never blind to its defects. See, he was not some Pollyanna. He didn't look through rose-colored glasses. He began his rural crusade not to seek sanctuary in some agrarian Garden of Eden, but because he realized that his beloved life on the land was in the state of collapse. Even as a successful pastor in Portland, he sensed that the countryside was in trouble. And when he returned, he was a chaplain in World War I, and when he returned, the officials of the Catholic Education Association in December of 1918 asked if he would do a study of rural life. This resulted in his report, The Rural Problem and Its Bearing of Catholic Education. It was while preparing this presentation that he became convinced that rural pastoral care was the foremost challenge to Catholic leaders in America. According to the early historian of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, Brother Raymond Whitty, it was this report that served almost as a call to arms for Catholic leaders to turn their attention from city streets to country dirt roads, and gave prominence to the organizations that O'Hara would later found. True, O'Hara was quick to say, difficulties were sure nothing new to country people. In fact, O'Hara conceded traditional problems on the farm, such as isolation, drudgery, were being ameliorated by such modern conveniences as the automobile, mail, new machinery, and rural electrification. He didn't mind that at all. He welcomed that and encouraged it. What alarmed him were newer problems, especially the continual drain, the seepage in rural population. Year after year, some of the brightest, youngest, and strongest country youth were abandoning the land. That hemorrhage, O'Hara said, would prove fatal to the church and the nation, and to heal it would be his top priority of the rural crusade. Using the statistics of the 1920 census, he would demonstrate that the city population was out of sight, mushrooming, produced not by birth, but by the influx of people fleeing the farm. And that scared the dickens out of him. A cause for alarm, he would write, is the rush to the city of all the most vigorous and competent of the rural population, leaving a deteriorated stock from which to replenish the city of the future. Why? Why? Yeah, the traditional problems of the country, but God knows the city had them. O'Hara was convinced that in large part it was because society was downgrading the agricultural profession. They were treating it as a business, not a way of life. And they were caricaturing the farmer as an ignorant bumpkin. He was furious about this. Not only this public opinion, but excessive mechanization was harmful to the agrarian vocation, contended O'Hara. Now, don't get me wrong, he ardently promoted modernization of the farm economy to keep it lucrative, but he felt too much machinery, too much planning, too many new methods, too much trust in scientific theories, too much concern for profit. All this excess tempted the farmer to view his sacred task purely as a business. Besides, he said, the more mechanized farming became, the fewer people would be required to till the earth. The very heart of the countryside, the small family homestead, would eventually be gobbled up by the insatiable appetite of agribusiness, which would hasten the implementation of the dreaded theory he called latifundia, which meant the aggrandizement of land until one owner held a huge estate filled by tenant farmers. When that happened, labor in the field would be no better than the production line in the urban factory, as the farmer became a tenant working soil not his own. Tenancy, wherein the farmer would lose his land but was still hired to work the crops, would become a greater threat as the Depression developed, since it attacked the foundation of O'Hara's rural ideology, the small family-owned farm. He was joined by other great Catholic agrarians, such as Eric Gill, Vincent McNabb, and G.K. Chesterton in England, joined by Hilaire Belloc, and even Dorothy Day here in the United States. Although country folk sure looked to the church for support, O'Hara was pretty blistering because he said the church isn't providing it. Turning to demographics, he demonstrated that the Catholic population was increasing at a rate far more slowly than the rest of the population, and the reason was evident. The Catholic people were 75% urban, and they weren't prolific. As he concluded, the only way to increase Catholic numbers, apart from immigration and conversion, of course, was through the systematic fostering of Catholic rural life. This was the most glaring rural perplexity. The Catholic people and resources were overwhelmingly concentrated in the stupid cities. O'Hara would note this, not bitterly, for he understood how it happened. The great volume of Catholic immigrants had been pressed into urban industrial life as soon as they left the gangplank. They had to be cared for with churches, parishes, schools, hospitals, orphanages, organizations, and so admirably, the church devoted its energy, money, and personnel to a heroic effort to serve the urban church. Now, the priest didn't condemn this. He simply asked, now such an effort needs to be made in the countryside. Instead, O'Hara lamented, bishops and priests and religious men and women and Catholic lay activists, with lauded exceptions, ignored the country. An assignment as a rural pastor was considered an insult, temporary at best until the guy sobered up, a time spent yearning for a promotion back to the city. Religious superiors claimed they couldn't waste members in the country with the needs of the city so critical. It seemed unfair to the people of the fields. They watched schools and convents and rectories and parish gymnasiums and homes for the aged and orphanages being constructed in abundance in the city, while they, at the wellspring of future population, couldn't afford to patch their roof or put in a new boiler. The most glaring lack, O'Hara insisted, came in Catholic education. 90% of Catholic schools were in the cities, although 1/2 of the total school population lives in rural districts. All of this meant that Catholics in the country couldn't depend on their church to help them. He didn't act in a vacuum. I don't know if you've heard about colonization. That was an early attempt to bring immigrants from the city to the countryside, and have them work on farms. Catholic colonization sounded good. There was a rural program of such leaders as Matthias Loris, the first Bishop of Dubuque, John Ireland here, John Lancaster Spalding in Peoria, Thomas Darcy McGee, an Irish nationalist. There were some successes, but most of those colonies flopped. They didn't have enough money, and the people didn't know how to farm. O'Hara wasn't fond of colonization. He said, once again, it's the city trying to get the country to help it out. He lost patience with this back to the land movement, so prominent among some Catholic leaders. There were also a lot of individuals. I don't want to just say O'Hara was the main guy here, folks. He may have been the main guy. He wasn't the only guy. There were great priests, and maybe some of these would resonate in your memories. I'm thinking of George Nell, the pastor in Island Grove, Illinois, who had developed programs for social and cultural recreation in the rural parishes. At Claryville, Missouri, the pastor George Hildner, fondly called Alfalfa George, personally mastered progressive farming techniques and taught them to his parishioners. Victor Day was in Helena, Montana, perfected in an attractive religious correspondence course to reach his scattered flock. O'Hara realized that there were dozens and dozens of such priests, active, devoted priests, and one of his goals was to bring them together in organization. Thus came the two organizations, well, the one organization, your own, and the office that he founded. He realized that we needed some organization. In 1921, he became the first director of the Rural Life Bureau of the National Catholic Welfare Council. That was the bishops, the early version of the bishops' conference. He became the first director. But he was kind of convinced shrewdly that that baby wasn't going to last, okay? So 2 years later, he founded, drum roll, Jim, the National Catholic Rural Life Conference. To this day, the most vibrant organization promoting Catholic rural causes and providing annual meetings and education and publications to serve the cause. You probably know as much about how it came about as I do. The American Country Life Association, led by a gentleman by the name of Henry Israel, obviously not from County Limerick, they were meeting in St. Louis in November of 1923, and he, knowing O'Hara's solicitude, invited Catholic participation. O'Hara got the idea to gather prominent Catholic agrarians in the United States to meet with them, but to have 2 days of meetings on their own to begin with. And he was startled when 173 attendants showed up at the first meeting on November 9th at St. Louis University. Father Thomas Carey was elected president. Edwin Vincent O'Hara was the executive secretary. And the Bishop of Des Moines, Thomas Drum, offered Father Michael Schlitz as executive secretary with headquarters in Des Moines and the Rural Life Bureau. As the Rural Life Bureau failed, as it did, the National Catholic Rural Life Conference exploded. A couple other things that would spring from this. He was so dedicated, everybody, to religious education. Yeah, he said, I wish we could have a grade school in every country parish, but we can't. So he started to form what he called the Religious Vacation School, where country children attended well-organized classes taught by sisters and seminarians on summer break who liked to be in the country, and the Religious Correspondence course, where succinct, colorful instructions with little quizzes were mailed to each family during the regular year. By the year 1934, 1,000 parishes were participating in those two, the religious vacation school and the correspondence courses in religious education. A priest who worked with O'Hara from the start and who would sort of become the international symbol of Catholic ruralism was Luigi Liguti of the Diocese of Des Moines. His Granger homestead development was so successful in implementing Catholic rural life ideology that it came to the attention of the New Deal and was visited by none other than the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm thinking as well, everybody, of William Howard Bishop, a priest of the Archdiocese of Baltimore, noted for his pastoral leadership in the country, but most remembered for his formation of the Home Missionaries of America, which would become known as Glen Mary. So too was O'Hara impressed with the thought of Virgil Michael, as I mentioned, the Benedictine liturgist from up the road. Fascinating, think about this, I'm going to bring it up at the end. Virgil Michael developed the magnificent philosophy of Christian personalism that was very popular in Catholic philosophy at the time. He would hold that agrarian life offered the best setting for accenting the value, the innate dignity of the human person and the sacredness of human life. And he considered country people most open to the value of corporate liturgical prayer. Another guy, Aloysius Munch, rector of St. Francis de Sales Seminary in Milwaukee, bishop of Fargo, and finally papal nuncio in post-war Germany. He was very close to O'Hara. The litany of prominent Catholic leaders who rose to prominence in and through the rural apostolate would include people such as John Lafarge, the Jesuit who extended agrarian concern to include the black tenant farmer, Frank Bruce, the famous Milwaukee publisher, the Benedictines Edgar Schmiedler, Alcuin Deutsch, and Martin Scherber, all supporters of O'Hara's crusade. William Malloy, later Bishop of Covington, Vincent Ryan, later Bishop of Bismarck. Not only did O'Hara's rural ideology attract people, it eventually would spawn at least two other prominent movements which came to rival their parent in prominence. The Confraternity of Christian Doctrine began as a feature of O'Hara's rural life program, and by 1934 became an autonomous national organization, which would absorb all of O'Hara's energy. This inspired the Catholic Biblical Association. The second movement was that of liturgical renewal, which in later decades became one of the most influential movements in the church. From the start, O'Hara would welcome such liturgists as Virgil Michael, William Bush, Martin Hellriegel under his rural umbrella, since all of them believed that country parishes offered soil fertile for liturgical renewal. O'Hara's Catholic rural ideology had developed from America's heartland as he mustered pastors, religious, lay leaders, and simple farm families who looked to the church they cherished to provide direction and support in preserving rural life. From his own St. Mary's Parish in Oregon, to the offices of the Rural Life Bureau in DC, to the annual meetings of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, in the pages of St. Isidore's Plow, to the fields of Europe and even Latin America, O'Hara seemed only trying to remind people that there's something sacramental about country life, and that thus it deserved to be treated with dignity and care. Now, folks, I'd like your help in three things. Number one, I want to see, is O'Hara's diagnosis of Catholic rural life still accurate? You know that better than, I don't know much about farm life, okay? I'm the Archbishop of New York, for crying out loud. Although, by the way, that's a heavily rural diocese, as most in the United States are. One of the few that would not be would be my neighbor, Brooklyn, Queens. They grow asphalt there. They don't grow grass. See, let me go through a few things and let you can let me know, either personally or if you got questions or observations, if O'Hara's concerns are still accurate. Secondly, are there any new developments that should challenge us today as much as those old ones challenged O'Hara? And finally, are there some future causes that we can rise to as O'Hara rose to his? What's still true today in O'Hara's analysis? You ready? I contend this. The threats to small family farms by agribusiness are still towering, are they not? Number two, the shrinking of our Catholic infrastructure due to parish mergers threatens rural parishes more than urban ones. When bishops have the tough decisions to merge parishes because of shrinking clergy, it's very often the country parishes that suffer. When I got to New York, we had 400 parishes. We have 300 now. It was relatively easy for me to close parishes in Manhattan, where most of them were, because the people had moved, and they were 3 blocks apart. It's not easy to close parishes in the countryside, where people have given their entire life there, their parents and grandparents, and all of a sudden to lose their parish with the closest one being 20 miles away. So I worry that O'Hara was right, and it's still true today, that the church sometimes, that the countryside gets snubbed by the institutional church. It's still true today, I contend, that the countryside is the source of large families and vocations. Vocations. Even in New York, when I do the demographics of the seminarians that we have, I'm astounded as how many come from the countryside. And a fourth problem that I would contend is still true, that O'Hara raised way back then, is that we still have the nasty caricaturing of rural life as deplorable people by the elites of our nation. So those are areas, I think, that O'Hara uncovered that are still accurate. Here's some things that I think have changed. Today, the problem is not the drain to the city, but from the city. People aren't leaving the countryside anymore, they're leaving the cities, right? And guess where they're moving? To the countryside, meaning the rural acreage is shrinking as suburbs and exurbs gobble up all the family farms. There's no lure of the cities anymore to our young families. I see that in New York. We have a lot of young people who come to New York for jobs, okay? When they get married, they'll leave. When I visit parishes on Manhattan, there are no kids. See? There are no kids. So people now are leaving the city and going to the countryside. Secondly, the problem of smaller families is true not only of the city, as O'Hara contended, but now in the country. And finally, I think a new challenge today is that the volunteer organizations upon which rural life Catholics depended are no longer as vibrant. The Centralverein, for instance, a magnificent German-American Catholic organization that was really strong in the 1880s, 1890s, up until, no surprise, the First World War, is no longer even around. The Knights of Columbus, thanks be to God we got them. I was so happy to see them today. They'd be the first to admit that as strong as they are in the countryside, they're still stretched with the services that they can provide. And certainly, everybody, here's the change today. O'Hara remembered how he would beg to have Catholic institutions on the countryside. Now we ain't got them anywhere, right? Because we're dealing with the decimation of a Catholic coherent infrastructure. Our schools, my brother and sister-in-law were up for St. Patrick's Day, okay? And my brother Pat, they're from St. Louis. My brother Patrick says, did you see that Fontbonne closed? That was the nearby Catholic college where he attended, closed. And then his wife said, and did you hear that Little Flower Grade School is closed? And then I said, what about Immaculate Conception, Mom and Dad's home parish? It's closed. Closing, 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 all right? You'd think it was yard sales, fire sales or something, as our Catholic institutional life diminishes. So now O'Hara would say, build hospitals in the countryside. Well, now we don't have that many to build anywhere. Bring schools to the countryside. We're closing them, all right? About the only thing flourishing are cemeteries. That ain't a good sign, okay? So you see what I'm saying? That's sort of an answer that O'Hara had that doesn't seem to apply anymore. Finally, everybody, what challenges now kind of tease and tantalize us as those did Edwin O'Hara? Think of some things. I don't have answers to this. You're the experts on this. I might have been the expert on the formative years. I ain't the expert on today. Number one, we got to think about the immigrant on the soil. Many of the immigrants that come to our country now, which is it's a huge pastoral challenge for the Catholic Church in the United States, sure is for us in New York, are farmers. And is there a creative way that we can settle them on the land? It's true in the Archdiocese of New York that they are now migrant workers on our farms in the north. Remember, O'Hara said, I don't want these immigrants coming to the countryside because they're not farmers. They end up part of the dispossessed, the poor. Well, not the immigrants today. They are farmers. Is there a way that we can, in a healthy, productive way, get them attached to the land? Secondly, the farmer has a natural interest in the environment. So if we could lasso them to the ringing call of Pope Francis to protect the environment. The farmer is the natural audience for Laudato Si, as he and she see the rhythm in property and in nature and would fight for the protection of the environment because they depend upon it so much. Thirdly, is the farm the laboratory for Christian personalism? I mentioned that from Virgil Michael. As you would know, it became a trumpet during the magisterium of Pope St. John Paul II, developed by Pope Benedict and continued by Pope Francis. Christian personalism, that all problems today in society come from a faulty understanding of the human person. If we get the anthropology right, that we are children of God, made in his image and likeness, worthy of dignity and respect, whose life was worth the precious blood of our Savior and is destined for all eternity. If we get that view of the person right, everything else works out. And is that naturally fostered on the land, on the farm? And finally today, I think we need to see the countryside as a natural arena for the lay apostolate, all right? O'Hara would push the role of the rural pastor, and rightly so. Well, we don't have that many today, all right? We do have abundant, articulate, committed, passionate lay Catholics on the land, and should this be the natural arena for the lay vocation that was so energized by the Second Vatican Council? For those, I don't have the answers, but I'm sure privileged to present them to an audience that I'm rather confident does. I sure appreciate your interest. Thanks for listening. I hope it was worth your while. Would you bring me a glass of water up, Jim? All right? Thank you. All right?